It began on a cold January morning in 1946, in a city that no longer had a name worth saying aloud. Cologne, Hamburg, Munich, all looked the same then, cities made of bricks and silence. The war had left Germany a country without sound, except for crack of frost and the slow, nervous heartbeat of survival. But that winter, another kind of rhythm began, the gentle knocking of postmen at battered doors. Letters were arriving from across the Atlantic, from men in uniform who once marched through these same streets with helmets shining in foreign sunlight. For many women, those letters were as unexpected as spring in a graveyard. They began with cautious words, "Dear Fräulein," and often ended with hope disguised as politeness. Perhaps we might correspond further. The senders were American soldiers, former occupiers now turned writers of tender words. Some had met these women during duty brief, chance encounters in ruined cafes, hospital wards, or the crowded dance halls the Allies had reopened to remind the defeated what joy once looked like. Others wrote through introductions arranged by chaplains or friends, a curious post-war experiment in transatlantic matchmaking. The women who replied were not naive. They were survivors. They had stood in ration lines for bread, melted snow for washing water, and watched entire streets vanish under British and American bombers. Their fathers were missing, their brothers buried, their homes half standing. And yet, against all logic, they wrote back. In one letter preserved in a museum in Stuttgart, a young woman named Liesel ends a reply with the words, "It is strange, writing to someone who once wore a gun, but perhaps peace begins with strangers." What followed was something few could have predicted. The quiet birth of one of the most remarkable love migrations in modern history. By 1947, U.S. authorities estimated that more than 20,000 German women were engaged or married to American servicemen. To some, it seemed scandalous. To others, miraculous. Newspapers called them war brides, but the term barely touched the truth. They were ambassadors of forgiveness, crossing oceans that governments could barely navigate. The process of becoming a war bride was anything but romantic. Paperwork piled up higher than wedding cakes. Each woman underwent interviews, medical screenings, and moral checks under the War Brides Act of 1945, a law designed to reunite servicemen with foreign spouses, but haunted by the political caution of its time. Were they spies? Opportunists? Victims of war? The questions hung like smoke in the consular offices of Frankfurt and Munich. Yet most women passed, their faces calm but their hands trembling as they signed their futures in blue ink. Then came the voyage. Steamships like the SS Ernie Pyle and Marine Flasher became floating corridors between despair and hope. In photographs in the era, hundreds of young women stand on deck, their hair pulled back by the sea wind, clutching small suitcases, the sum of their old lives packed neatly inside. Some carried wedding rings. Others, just a promise written on paper. When New York Harbor appeared to the morning mist, the Statue of Liberty looked both familiar and foreign, a symbol they had once seen on enemy propaganda posters, now waving them toward new beginnings. One bride, Anna Richter from Bremen, wrote in her diary, "I thought America would smell like freedom. It smelled like gasoline and coffee." Her husband, Private James Richter, was waiting on the dock, suddenly shy, suddenly real, his uniform traded for a plaid shirt and nervous smile. They kissed like strangers who remembered each other from a dream. But for every tender reunion, there were glances of curiosity and sometimes judgment. Crowds gathered to watch the German brides disembark. Journalists called them the prettiest cargo of the year. The headline sparkled, but the undertone was clear. Fascination mixed with suspicion. Could love really grow from the ashes of war? Could enemies truly become family? That night, as trains carried the women inland, to Illinois, Texas, Ohio, California, the enormity of what they'd done began to settle in. The letters that had promised a new life had become tickets to a world they didn't yet understand. They couldn't yet imagine the loneliness of the quiet farmhouse, the puzzled smiles of their accents, the endless small misunderstandings that would test both heart and identity. But on that first night in America, exhaustion and wonder blurred together. The cities glowed with electricity they hadn't seen in years. The grocery shelves stretched on endlessly. Butter, sugar, meat, all things rationed back home now abundant and cheap. One woman stood in a supermarket aisle and wept because she didn't need coupons anymore. The German brides of 1946 and 1947 were not chasing fairy tales. They were chasing survival, and maybe something braver. The belief that peace could be personal, that a letter could rewrite history, that love could bloom not in spite of war, but because of it. And as America slept that winter, scattered across its vast plains and shining cities, a quiet transformation began, one that neither nation fully understood yet, but both would feel for generations to come. The first thing most of the German brides noticed about America wasn't its freedom. It was its silence, not the kind born of fear, like in the ruins it left behind, but a quiet so vast it seemed to swallow thought itself. The endless plains of Kansas, the snow-covered stillness of Minnesota, the open skies of Texas. These were landscapes without scars. No rubble, no sirens, no ghosts in the alleyways. For the first time in years, they could sleep without listening for bombs. But peace, they soon learned, came with its own kind of loneliness. In the early mornings, while their new husbands left for work, the women would stand at kitchen windows, staring at fields or neighborhoods that felt both safe and unreachable. Neighbors waved politely but slowly. Conversations were careful. The accent that had once sounded exotic during wartime romances now carried the weight of a defeated empire. In small towns especially, whispers followed them: the German girl, the war bride. One woman from Stuttgart, now living in rural Ohio, recalled being handed exact change at a grocery store with the coins placed on the counter, not in her palm. They weren't cruel, she said, just cautious. But caution can feel like distance. They tried to adapt. They learned recipes from their mother-in-laws, practiced church hymns in English, and smiled through jokes they only half understood. Yet every gesture of politeness carried the ache of translation. The world around them was saturated with abundance: refrigerators, shiny new Chevrolets, whole stores devoted to dresses. But belonging could not be bought. Their husbands, too, were adjusting to a peacetime identity that felt smaller than the war they'd survived. They were no longer heroes. They were husbands, fathers, clerks, and mechanics. The women who once wrote them letters of admiration now wrote grocery lists. And so the marriages that began as daring stories sometimes turned into quiet battlegrounds. Love tested not by distance, but by routine. Still, resilience became their inheritance. They found one another through informal networks, writing letters, sharing recipes, or meeting in church basements. In Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, small communities of war brides began to form. English lessons mixed with laughter, nostalgia, mingling with practicality. They exchanged survival tips: how to make sauerkraut with American cabbage, where to find decent coffee, how to answer when asked about the Hitler years. For many, motherhood offered a new anchor. Their children became bridges between worlds, American in accent, but carrying the eyes, gestures, and lullabies of another country. In old diaries that survived the decades, these women wrote with startling clarity about the dual life they led. One, named Margaret from Hamburg, wrote in 1952, "I am no longer German enough for Germany and never American enough for America. But I am something new, something between." Her words, though private, captured an unspoken truth shared by thousands. The irony was that America, too, was changing. The 1950s were years of optimism, of neon signs and backyard barbecues, of a country eager to forget the darkness it had fought against. But the German brides could never forget when television sets began to fill living rooms with images of the Cold War, when new headlines spoke of enemies behind new borders. Many felt a familiar tremor of fear. They understood better than anyone how fast us and them could change. And yet, many of them thrived in quiet ways. They became nurses in local hospitals, teachers in public schools, business owners beside their husbands. They sent money back to relatives in a rebuilding Germany, bridging two worlds that governments could barely keep in dialogue. Some returned to visit after the Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's economic miracle, transformed their homeland into a place both recognizable and strange. They were greeted as Americans now, admired for the confidence that had once marked them as outsiders. With time, their accents softened. Their children grew up reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, their daughters wearing poodle skirts, their sons joining Little League. But in the evenings, when the house was quiet, many still reached for a small box tucked away in a drawer, filled with old letters, written in neat handwriting, on paper that smelled faintly of sea and hope. Those were the letters that had brought them here, from rubble to suburbia, from hunger to plenty. Decades later, when some of these women spoke to historians or journalists, their memories carried the same blend of wonder and disbelief. "I never stopped being grateful," one said, "but I never stopped missing something either." Gratitude and loss, that was the bargain. For every supermarket aisle of plenty, there was a word she could never translate. For every warm smile, a memory of a mother she'd never see again. By the mid-1950s, their story had faded from the headlines. America had absorbed them, and they had absorbed America in turn. The war bride became invisible, ordinary citizens in extraordinary peace. But their quiet courage endured, stitched into fabric of post-war life. They proved that reconciliation doesn't always happen at peace conferences or in marble halls. Sometimes it happens in kitchens, across dinner tables, in the small act of choosing to stay. When one of them, now elderly, was asked what she remembered most about arriving in America, she smiled faintly and said, "The air smelled like gasoline and promise. I didn't know which was stronger." It's a fitting epitaph for an era, the women who cross an ocean not only to find love, but to redefine it. The German brides who couldn't believe their new American lives taught the world that even in the long shadow of war, hearts can still become citizens of peace.